Dorset, June 1815. The church of St. Marin stood at the edge of the village, in the way that old churches stand at the edge of old villages, as though the stone had simply decided one afternoon to become a building, and the village had arranged itself accordingly. It had stood there since the 13th century. It had survived fire, Reformation, and the sustained indifference of 3 generations of parish wardens. It would survive this. 47 people filled the pews. This was every family of consequence in the southern half of the county, and several from the northern half who had invented reasons to attend, and they sat in the June morning light that came through the east window in long colored shafts, and they watched the Duke of Windermere stand at the altar and wait for the woman walking toward him. Senara Orvale came down the aisle on her father's arm. She wore ivory, not white, ivory, the color of old paper and good linen, and things that have been considered carefully before being chosen. Her dark hair was pinned with her mother's combs, and her posture was the kind that other women noticed before they noticed the dress, the posture of a woman who had been walking into rooms that were not designed for her since she was 14 and had stopped apologizing for it around the time she turned 16. Hulin Orville, beside her, walked with the measured pace of a man delivering the most important thing he had ever built to a man he had spent 8 months trying to decide about. He had decided. He was not entirely settled about the decision. He walked anyway. The church was silent in the particular way that churches are silent when something important is about to happen, and everyone in the building knows it. The Reverend Mr. Bassett stood at the altar with his prayer book open and his expression arranged into the professional serenity of a man who had performed this ceremony 400 times and believed each one mattered, which was the quality that made him good at the work. The Duke stood at the front. Aldrich Vane, 5th Duke of Windermere, tall in the way that certain men are tall, where the height is not the first thing you notice because the stillness is. He stood with his hands at his sides and his shoulders set, and his expression held in the precise register of a man who was feeling something very large and managing it into something very controlled. And he watched her come toward him, and the watching was the only thing about him that was not controlled. Senara reached the altar. Her father placed her hand in the Duke's hand and stepped back and sat in the front pew and folded his own hands and looked straight ahead with the composure of a man who had done what he could and was now required to trust the outcome. The ceremony began. The Reverend Mr. Bassett spoke the words that the church had been speaking for centuries in the voice that carried to the back pews without effort, and the June light moved across the stone floor, and the 47 guests sat in the quality of silence that meant they were listening not just to the words, but to the space between the words, because this was not a wedding that had arrived without weather. The county knew the story, or believed it did. The county had been following the story since the previous October, with the invested attention of people who had nothing better to watch and everything to say about it. And the versions had multiplied in the way that versions do, until the truth was somewhere underneath a considerable pile of informed speculation. The vows proceeded. The Reverend Mr. Bassett reached the passage, and the Duke spoke, and his voice was clear and carried in the stone space of the church, and then he said it. He said it in the voice she had heard once before, in a room she had walked out of 8 months ago, the voice of a man who had confused authority with safety and control with love, and had not yet learned the difference. "I expect obedience," the Duke of Windermere said at the altar of St. Marin's Church, in front of 47 people, and God and the June morning light, and Senara Orville, standing beside him in ivory, with her mother's combs in her hair and 8 months of evidence behind her, turned to face him fully. She turned with the unhurried precision of a woman who had been preparing for this exact moment without knowing she was preparing for it, and she looked at him with the expression he had learned to recognize and had never once been able to manage. And she said, clearly and without hesitation, in a voice that reached every pew in the church, "I do not." The silence that followed was not the respectful silence of a ceremony. It was the stunned, breathless silence of 47 people who had just witnessed something they would be discussing for the rest of their natural lives. The Reverend Mr. Bassett looked up from his prayer book. Hewlin Orvale closed his eyes briefly in the front pew. Lady Panteri, seated 3 rows back on the groom's side, pressed her lips together in an expression that could have been horror and was not, and the Duke of Windermere looked at the woman standing beside him at the altar, the woman who had just said the 2 words that no one in his family had heard, directed at a vein in 200 years of marriage ceremonies. And something moved in his expression that the front 4 rows could see and the back rows would argue about for decades. But that was June. The story began in October, 8 months before the altar, 8 months before the 2 words that stopped a church in a drawing room 40 miles away, where a woman who did not yet know what she was walking into sat down across from a man who did not yet know what he was about to lose. Dorset, October 1814. The interview had been arranged by Lady Panteri, the Duke's godmother, the kind of woman who believed that most problems could be solved by putting the correct people in the correct room and allowing efficiency to do its work. She had been solving problems this way for 30 years. The Duke of Windermere required a wife. This was not gossip. This was structural. The estate carried obligations that a single man could defer, but not indefinitely, and the county had been watching the deferral with the patient attention of people who understood that the Duke's situation was not simple, and that the reason it was not simple had a name, though the name was spoken carefully and never in his presence. The name was Marguerite. She had been the first Duchess of Windermere for 3 years. She had been beautiful and charming and incapable of fidelity, and the damage she had done to the Windermere name had been repaired publicly by the Duke's solicitors and privately by no one, because the private damage was not the kind that solicitors could reach. Lady Panteri had identified Sonara Orville through the efficient network of a woman who knew everyone and forgot nothing. The Orville fortune was considerable. Hewlin Orvale had built it from a single textile mill in Cumbria into an operation that now supplied half the drapers in the north of England. And he had done it with the particular tenacity of a self-made man who understood that money without strategy was just numbers. His daughter had inherited the strategy. Sonara arrived at Windermere Hall on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of October, accompanied by her father and the focused composure of a woman who had been sitting across from powerful men since her father first brought her to a negotiation at the age of 14. She wore dark blue, well-made, the kind of dress that communicated means without performance, and she carried in her head a complete accounting of the Windermere estate's public finances, which she had assembled from the county records, and 2 conversations with a solicitor in Dorchester who had not entirely understood why a young woman was asking. The drawing room at Windermere Hall was large and cold in the way of country houses in October. She noted the paintings, which were good. She noted the furniture, which was old and maintained rather than replaced, which told her something about the estate's cash position. She sat and waited. The Duke arrived 7 minutes after the appointed time, which she noted, and which she did not hold against him, because the house was large enough that 7 minutes could be geography rather than discourtesy. He was not what she had expected. She had expected a man diminished by what he had been through, and what she found instead was a man who had taken what he had been through and built it into a kind of architecture. He carried himself with the rigid precision of someone who had decided exactly how much of himself to present and had eliminated everything else. "Miss Orvale, Your Grace." Her father and Lady Pentery had arranged themselves near the window in the configuration of two people who wished to be present without being relevant, and the Duke looked at this arrangement and then at Senara and said, with the efficiency of a man who did not enjoy preamble, "I prefer to speak directly. Shall we?" They were shown to his study. It was a working room, not a display. She noted the ledgers on the desk, the correspondence stacked in order of priority, the estate map pinned to the wall with annotations. In a hand she assumed was his, a man who ran his own affairs, another point catalogued. He sat behind the desk. She sat across from it. The arrangement told her everything about how he had categorized this meeting. She was on the interview side. He was on the deciding side. "I will not waste your time," he said. "I require a wife. The requirements are specific. I need a woman whose fortune will allow the estate to address several deferred obligations. I need a woman capable of managing a household of this scale and representing the Windermere name with appropriate conduct." He paused. He looked at her with the complete, assessing attention of a man conducting a valuation. "Above all," he said, "I expect obedience. I expect a wife who understands the hierarchy of a house such as this, who defers to the authority of the title, and who does not." He stopped. The stop was not a pause. It was a wall. Something behind his expression shifted and then was managed back into position. "Who does not mistake independence for partnership," he finished. Senara looked at him across the desk. She looked at the rigid set of his jaw and the careful architecture of his self-control and the particular way his hand had tightened on the arm of his chair when he said the word independence. And she understood, with the clarity she brought to every negotiation she had ever entered, that the blank space in his sentence, the wall he had hit, had nothing to do with her and everything to do with a woman named Marguerite, who had used the word independence to mean something that had broken him. She understood that he wasn't interviewing a wife. He was constructing a defense, and she was the building material. "Your first wife," she said. Something fractured behind his eyes, just for a moment, before the composure reassembled itself. "That is not relevant to this conversation." "It is the only thing relevant to this conversation," she said. "Everything you have just described, every requirement you have listed, is a response to a specific experience. You are not looking for a wife. You are looking for a guarantee that you will not be hurt again, and you have dressed the guarantee in the language of authority, because that is the language available to you." The silence that followed was absolute. She stood. She did not do it hastily. She rose from the chair with the measured deliberation of a woman who had decided something and wished the decision to be visible. "Thank you for your candor, your grace," she said. "I mean that without irony. You have been more honest than you intended, and I have more respect for the honesty than for the position it has produced." She looked at him once more, this man behind his desk, with his ledgers and his architecture and his wound organized into a list of requirements, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, which was not anger and not pity, but something adjacent to both and more useful than either. "I wish you well in your search," she said. "You will not find what you are looking for, because what you are looking for does not exist. But I wish you well in the looking." She left the study. She collected her father from the drawing room with the quiet efficiency of a woman concluding business, and they were in the carriage before Lady Pentery had fully registered what had happened. Her father waited until they had cleared the Windermere gates. "Well," he said. "He is wounded," Senara said. "He has organized the wound into a policy and hired a wife to enforce it. And you are not interested in the position." "I am not interested in being a policy enforcement." Her father looked at the Dorset hills passing in the October afternoon. "What are you interested in?" Sonara was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about the study and the ledgers, and the man behind the desk, who had shown her something he had not meant to show her, and had been more interesting in that unguarded fraction of a second than in anything he had said on purpose. "The Haversmere Mill estate," she said. "The listing came through the Dorchester solicitor last month. It is a sound property. The mill has water rights on the River Wine, and the acreage is excellent for the price." Her father was quiet for a long moment. "That property is 2 miles from Windermere Hall. It is an excellent investment. The mill supplies Windermere, has done for 50 years, which makes it a strategically valuable acquisition." Her father looked at her with the expression of a man who had been watching this particular person make decisions since she was 12, and had never once seen her make one that was purely about the numbers. "Sonara," he said. "It is a business decision, father." He said nothing further. She looked out the window at the Dorset countryside in the fading October light, and thought about a man who had confused obedience with safety, and she almost convinced herself that the mill was entirely about the water rights. She did not convince herself for long. Haversmere Mill was purchased on the 4th of November, which was 17 days after the interview at Windermere, and which was fast enough to confirm what her father already suspected, which was that his daughter had made her decision in the carriage and had spent the subsequent 17 days executing it with the efficiency she brought to everything she had already decided. The sale was complex. The mill carried water rights on the River Wine that fed 3 estates, Windermere being the largest and most dependent. The property included the mill house, 60 acres of farmland, a cottage row for the workers, and the rights to the river between Haversmere Bridge and the Windermere boundary stone. That stretch of water powered not only the mill, but the irrigation channels that kept the Windermere South meadows productive through the dry months. Sonara understood all of this before she signed. She had spent the 17 days studying the water rights, walking the property twice, engaging a surveyor from London, and reading every contract the previous owner had written with the surrounding estates. Owning Haversmere Mill did not merely make her the Duke's neighbor. It made her the person who controlled a resource his estate could not function without. Her father had watched this preparation with the attention of a man who recognized a campaign when he saw one. "You are not buying a mill," he had said on the second evening, over the accounts she had spread across the dining table at their Dorchester lodgings. "I am buying a mill, a house, 60 acres, and a set of water rights that will generate a reliable return regardless of external factors. You are buying a position." She had looked at him across the table with the expression that meant she knew he was right and was not going to confirm it. And he had returned to his own accounts and said nothing further, because he had also recognized, over the years, when his daughter's silence was the end of a conversation. The Duke of Windermere was informed of his new neighbor by his steward, a man named Garrick, who had served the Windermere estate for 18 years, and who had developed the ability to deliver significant information in the tone of insignificant information, which was a survival skill in a house governed by a man who did not appreciate surprise. "The Haversmere Mill property has been sold, Your Grace," Garrick said during the Thursday estate review, in the voice of a man mentioning the weather. "Sold to whom?" "A Miss Orville, Your Grace. Miss Sonara Orville, the daughter of Hewlin Orville, the textile man from Cumbria." The Duke set down the report he had been reading. He set it down with the careful, controlled motion of a man who was feeling something and was determining how much of it to allow into the room. "Miss Orville," he said. "Yes, Your Grace. The sale completed on the 4th. I understand she intends to take possession before the month is out." The Duke looked at the estate map on the wall, the one with his annotations, the one that showed Windermere and its boundaries, and the river and the mill that sat on the river like a lock on a chain. He looked at it for a long time. "The water rights," he said. "Transfer with the property, Your Grace, the supply contracts as well." "When do the contracts come up for renewal?" Garrick consulted his ledger. The flower contract renews in March. The irrigation access has no fixed term. It has operated on a handshake agreement since your father's time. The Duke was quiet. He was looking at the map, but Garrick understood that the Duke was seeing something else entirely. Have the water rights surveyed, the Duke said. Pull the original grant, and find whatever documentation exists for the handshake agreement with Haversmere. I believe it was entirely informal, Your Grace. The Duke looked at the map once more. Then we have a problem, because the woman who just purchased that mill does not do anything informally. Senara arrived at Haversmere on the 22nd of November with 2 wagons of household goods, a housekeeper she had brought from her father's house in Cumbria, a mill foreman she had hired from an operation in Wiltshire, and the surveyor she had engaged in London, who had already begun his assessment of the water rights before the wagons were fully unloaded. The county noticed. Dorset noticed everything. Being rural enough to have time for observation, and prosperous enough to have opinions, and the arrival of a young unmarried woman of considerable fortune at a working mill 2 miles from the most complicated duke in the county generated conversation the way the river wine generated power. She spent the first week learning the property with methodical attention. Every room, every outbuilding, every acre in the November cold. She walked the mill itself, learning the machinery from the foreman, understanding the relationship between river flow and grinding speed, the way she had learned her father's textile operations as a girl. 2 tenant cottages needed work that should have been done the previous spring. The south drainage wanted attention. She noted all of it. She had a plan by Friday. On Saturday morning, she walked to the river. The wine ran along the eastern edge of the property, clear and fast in November, the kind of river that knew what it was doing and had been doing it since before the mill was built. She stood on the bank, where the mill channel drew its water, and looked upstream toward the Windmere boundary, where the land rose gently and the river curved through a stand of ash trees that had been there longer than either estate. She heard the horse before she saw it. He came from the Windmere side at a walk, which meant he had not been in a hurry, and on a black horse that was too good for a casual ride, which meant he had chosen to come and had chosen how to come, and both choices had been deliberate. He stopped at the Haversmere Bridge, where the boundary stone stood between the 2 estates, and looked across at her. The river Wine ran between them. It was perhaps 30 feet across at that point, too wide to speak comfortably, too narrow to pretend they had not seen each other. He dismounted. He walked to the water's edge. She stayed where she was. Miss Orvale, he said across the river. Your Grace, she said. The November wind moved through the ash trees above them, and the river ran between them with the steady indifference of water that had been running for centuries and did not care who stood on either bank. You have been busy, he said. I have a mill to learn, and 60 acres to assess, and 2 tenant cottages that need roofing before winter sets in properly. Busy is the minimum requirement. He looked at her across the water. She looked at him. The distance between them was geographical, and also everything else. The water rights, he said, are mine, she said, as of the 4th of November. The irrigation access to the Windmere South Meadows has been maintained by informal agreement for 50 years. I am aware. I have reviewed the history. There is no formal contract, no recorded easement, and no legal obligation on the part of the mill owner to continue the arrangement. You have done your research. I always do my research, Your Grace. I believe you are familiar with that quality, having dismissed it in your study 5 weeks ago. The river ran between them. He was very still on the far bank. She could see the quality of his attention even across 30 feet of moving water, the same assessing focus she had seen in the study, except that something in it had shifted, and the shift looked like the beginning of a recognition he had not expected and was not sure what to do with, I have no intention of disrupting the irrigation supply, she said. The South Meadows benefit both estates, but I will be formalizing every agreement associated with this property, because informal arrangements rely on goodwill, and goodwill is not a term I find in any contract I have ever read. He looked at her for a long moment. You are going to be a very inconvenient neighbor, Miss Orvale, he said. I'm going to be a very competent neighbor, Your Grace, she said. Whether that is inconvenient depends entirely on what you were expecting. She held his gaze across the river for one beat longer than the exchange required, and then she turned and walked back toward the mill, and she did not look over her shoulder. And the not looking was as deliberate as everything else she had done since October. Behind her, across the river, the Duke of Windermere stood on his own bank and watched her go, and he did not move for some time after she had disappeared into the mill house, and the river ran between the two properties with the patient certainty of something that understood it would be there long after whatever was happening between these two people had resolved itself into whatever it was going to become. The irrigation negotiation began in the first week of December, which was when Sonara sent the Duke a letter proposing a formal meeting to establish written terms for the water access his estate had been using without documentation for half a century. The letter took 3 drafts. The first was too cold, the language of a solicitor rather than a neighbor, and she recognized halfway through the second paragraph that she was performing indifference, which was worse than showing warmth because it required more effort and convinced no one. The second draft was too warm, which she discovered only by reading it aloud to herself in the Millhouse library at 11 in the evening, and hearing the way certain phrases leaned toward a man rather than toward a contract. The third draft was precisely correct. Factual, specific, structured, ending with a proposed meeting date and a list of documents she would bring, and she sent it before she could write a fourth. His reply came the following morning. It was in his own hand, rather than Garrick's, which she noted, and it said, Miss Orvale, Thursday next, 10 in the morning. The boundary stone. I will bring the original water grant. Windermere. She read this twice. She noted the absence of pleasantry, the directness, the assumption that she would come. She noted that he had written it himself. She found the directness, against her better judgment, more honest than courtesy would have been, and she sent back a reply of equal brevity confirming the date. Thursday was cold and sharp in the way December mornings in Dorset could be, where the frost held until noon and the light had the quality of something that had been cleaned overnight. She arrived at the boundary stone at 5 minutes before 10 with her surveyor, the water rights documentation, and the complete set of historical contracts she had obtained from the previous mill owner's solicitor. The Duke was already there. He was on foot, Garrick beside him, the original water grant in a leather case under his arm. They spread the documents on the flat top of the boundary stone, her contracts on one side, his grant on the other, and stood on opposite banks of the argument and read each other's evidence with the focused attention of two people who were both entirely correct and entirely at odds. The original grant, he said, establishes the right of the Windermere estate to draw from the wine for agricultural purposes. It predates the mill by 40 years. The grant establishes a right to draw from the river, she said. It doesn't establish a right to draw through the mill channel, which was built by the mill owner in 1789 and is located entirely on Haversmere land. The channel was built to serve Windermere. The channel was built to power the mill. That it also served Windermere was a courtesy extended by the mill owner and maintained by informal agreement. Courtesy and legal right are different things. He looked at her across the boundary stone. She held his gaze without adjustment. You have read the grant very carefully, he said. I have read everything very carefully, Your Grace. It is how I operate. You might recall from our previous meeting that I take preparation seriously, even when the other party has decided the outcome before the conversation begins. Something moved in his expression. Not the managed control. Something underneath it. Something that looked like the beginning of a reassessment that he was conducting in real time and was not entirely comfortable with. The negotiation lasted 2 hours. They went through every document, every historical precedent, every clause and implication, and she matched him point for point with a precision that Garrick later described to the Windmere housekeeper as like watching two people fence, except with paperwork, and neither of them was losing. At the end of 2 hours, standing at the boundary stone in the December cold, with their breath visible and the documents spread between them, the Duke made a proposal. A formal contract, he said. 20-year term. Windmere pays a fair annual fee for irrigation access through the mill channel. The fee is reviewed every 5 years against market rates. The mill owner, meaning you, maintains the channel. Windmere maintains the upstream banks that affect flow. She looked at the proposal. It was fair. It was more than fair. It conceded the legal point entirely, acknowledged her ownership of the channel, and offered payment for something his estate had been receiving for free for 50 years. You could contest this, she said. The original grant gives you a strong position. A county court would likely find in your favor on historical grounds. It would take a year and cost both of us considerably, he said, and at the end of it, one of us would have the water, and the other would have a grievance. And I have learned recently that grievances are expensive things to maintain. She looked at him. He had said recently in a way that carried more weight than the word was designed to hold. I accept the proposal, she said, on the condition that the formal contract is drawn by an independent solicitor, not yours and not mine. Agreed. She extended her hand across the boundary stone. He looked at it. The hand of a woman who ran a mill in a glove that was good quality and slightly ink-stained at the right forefinger. He took it. The handshake was brief and firm and meant exactly what it was. I will have my solicitor send the draft terms by Monday, she said. I will review them by Wednesday, he said. She gathered her documents. She turned to leave. And then he said something she had not expected. Miss Orvale, she turned back. The Millhouse Library, he said. Garrick mentioned you have been ordering books from London. Agricultural improvement, riparian law, county administration. I have, he paused. The pause was the length of a man deciding whether to say something that existed outside the negotiation. I have a copy of Hartwell's treatise on river management, the 1809 edition, which is considerably better than the 1812 revision. It is not available commercially. If you would find it useful, I will have it sent. She looked at him. He was looking at the boundary stone, not at her, which was the only indication that the offer had cost him something to make. I would find it very useful, she said. Thank you. It is a practical matter, he said. You manage the channel that feeds my estate. It is in my interest that you are well informed. Of course, she said. Entirely practical. He looked at her then. She looked at him. The December morning held them both in its cold, clean light, and neither of them said anything further, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which was more significant than anything they could have said to fill it. The book arrived at Haversmere the following afternoon, delivered by a Windmere groom, wrapped in cloth, with a note in the Duke's hand that said simply, Chapter 9 is the most relevant. W. She opened it that evening in the Millhouse Library. She read Chapter 9. He was right. It was precisely relevant. She also noticed, on the title page, a handwritten inscription that read, To Aldrich, from your father, who trusts you will make better use of this than I did. She looked at the inscription for a long time. She thought about a man who had offered her a book and called it practical, and who had given her, without meaning to, something that wasn't practical at all. The winter social season in Dorset operated on the same principles as winter social seasons in every prosperous English county, which was to say that the same families attended the same dinners in the same houses in the same rotation, with the rehearsed efficiency of people who had been performing this ritual for generations and had refined it to the point where it was indistinguishable from genuine pleasure. Senara was received with the careful warmth of a county that had not decided what to make of her. She was wealthy enough to be included. She was not titled enough to be assumed. She ran a working mill, which was either admirable or eccentric depending on who was speaking, and she had purchased property 2 miles from the most talked-about Duke in Dorset, which was either shrewd or presumptuous, depending on the same variable. She and the Duke were at the same dinner 4 times in January and February. The first was at Penworth House, where they were seated at opposite ends of the table and exchanged exactly one remark about the water contract, which was overheard by Mrs. Fenister and became the primary topic of discussion at the second dinner. The second was at Harlow Manor, hosted by Lord Harlow, with the expansive hospitality of a man who believed his own generosity was evidence of his importance. The third was at Windmere Hall itself, a formal occasion for 14, at which Senara was seated 3 places from the Duke and spent 40 minutes discussing river management with Garrick, who had been placed beside her by an arrangement she suspected was not accidental. The fourth dinner was at Lady Pentory's house, which was the smaller and more dangerous of the gatherings, because Lady Pentory's dinners had 12 people and no room to hide. It was at this dinner that Lady Pentory found her moment. The meal had concluded. The party had moved to the drawing room, and Senara was standing at the window, looking at the February garden in the last light, when Lady Pentory materialized beside her with the quiet certainty of a woman who had been waiting for this conversation and had chosen the location for it. "He sent you the Hartwell book," Lady Pentory said without preamble. "He did." "The one with his father's inscription." Senara looked at her. "You know the book." "I know every book in that library. I know which ones have inscriptions, and which ones he has read, and which ones he keeps on the shelf closest to the desk, which are the ones that matter to him." She paused. The Hartwell treatise was on the close shelf. Senara said nothing. She looked at the garden. "He has not lent a book from that shelf to anyone," Lady Pentory said, "since Marguerite, and Marguerite never returned it, which was the least of what she didn't return." Lady Pentory. "I am not matchmaking," Lady Pentory said with the serene dishonesty of a woman who was absolutely matchmaking. "I am providing context. He is my godson. I have watched him build that architecture of his, brick by brick, since the divorce. I have watched him turn himself into a policy, and I have watched him, over the past 3 months, begin to find the policy inadequate." She looked at Senara with the direct attention of a woman who had survived 40 years of society by seeing things clearly and saying them without apology. "You are the reason the policy is failing," she said. "I thought you should know, in case you had not noticed, which I doubt, because you strike me as a woman who notices everything and admits to approximately half of it." Senara held her gaze. "I bought a mill," she said. "I negotiated a water contract. I have been a competent neighbor. None of that constitutes a reason for anyone's policy to fail." "No," Lady Pentory agreed, "but the way you have done it does. You have been right about everything. You have been right without asking for permission, and without needing his approval, and without once performing the kind of deference he told himself he required. And he has been watching you be right for 3 months, and discovering that rightness in a woman is not the threat he had organized his life around avoiding." She paused. "It is something else entirely, and he doesn't know what to do with it." Senara looked across the drawing room at the Duke, who was in conversation with 2 men whose names she had learned at the second dinner, and whose opinions she had already catalogued as conventional and unhelpful. He was managing the conversation with the precision she had come to expect, but she could see, from across the room, the quality of attention that was not directed at the men he was speaking to. "I did not come to Dorset to fix him," she said. "No," Lady Pentery said. "You came to Dorset to prove a point. The question is what happens now that the point has been proved and you are still here." Sonara looked at her tea. She looked at the February garden. She thought about a book with an inscription from a dead father, offered across a boundary stone and called practical, and about the way the word practical had been doing a great deal of work in their conversations, that it was not structurally designed to bear. "I do not know," she said, and it was the first honest thing she had said about the Duke of Windermere to anyone other than herself. Lady Pentery nodded, once, with the satisfaction of a woman who had asked for honesty and received it. "That is an excellent place to begin," she said. "Knowing that you do not know is considerably better than knowing something that is wrong, which is what he has been doing since October." She excused herself with the economy of a woman who had delivered what she came to deliver and was not going to overstay. Sonara stood at the window for a moment after she had gone. She looked across the room at the Duke. He looked up from his conversation and met her eyes, and the meeting lasted one beat longer than the social register required. And then he looked away, and she looked away, and the drawing room continued around them, and neither of them said anything further that evening, and it cost them both something they were not yet prepared to name. She went home to Haversmere in the February dark and sat in the Mill-House library with the Hartwell treatise on the desk and the inscription visible on the title page, and she thought about what Lady Pentery had said, and she thought about what she had not said to Lady Pentery, which was that the point had been proved somewhere around December, and she had stayed anyway, and the staying was the thing she could not file under strategy anymore. And 2 miles away, in the Windermere library, the Duke sat at the desk where he had once told a woman to expect obedience, and he looked at the empty space on the close shelf where the Hartwell treatise had been, and he thought about the fact that the shelf looked better without it, because the book was where it was supposed to be, which was a thought he was not ready to examine and could not stop having. The spring assembly at Penworth House was the first large gathering of the season. 38 people, the full county. Mrs. Fenister had insisted on the early March date because she believed the family who hosted first set the tone, and she intended the tone to be hers. Sonara arrived with Lady Pentery, who had developed the habit of collecting her for these occasions without formal arrangement. During the ride, Lady Pentery had said exactly one thing of relevance. "Lord Harlow has been speaking about you to the Fenisters." Speaking what, precisely? The usual vocabulary. New money, northern origins, a woman alone at a mill. The language of a man who has never been required to earn anything and resents those who have. Lord Harlow was a baronet of 54 who had inherited his title, his land, and his opinions from his father, and had revised none of them. He had attached himself to the Duke's social orbit with the gravitational loyalty of a man who confused proximity to power with possession of it. The Duke was there when they arrived. He was across the room in conversation with Sir Arden Kellaway and a man she did not recognize, and he looked up when she entered, and the looking was the thing she had stopped pretending not to notice, the quality of attention that existed outside the managed architecture, and that she had been cataloging for 3 months with the rigor of a woman who catalogs everything and acts on approximately half of it. The evening proceeded as these evenings did. She talked about the spring planting with Mrs. Fenister, about the mill operations with Sir Arden Kellaway, who had a genuine interest in water engineering. She talked about the county road improvement with Lady Pentery and 2 younger women going up to London in April, and then the Duke appeared at Sir Arden's elbow during the water discussion and stayed, and the 3 of them talked about river management until Sir Arden was called away, and then it was just the 2 of them, and the conversation moved from rivers to the mill channel to a question he asked about her father's textile operations in Cumbria. That was the first question he had asked her about herself, rather than about the water or the land or the contract. She answered it. He listened with the complete attention she had come to recognize, the attention that had nothing managed in it. He asked a second question. She thought, this is what it looks like when he is present rather than performing. She thought, I should not be taking notes on this. Lord Harlow arrived at her left shoulder. She had tracked his trajectory for 20 minutes and noted it was converging on her position with a deliberateness that was not casual. He had chosen his moment. She and the Duke were alone together in the most visible part of the room, and there were 6 people within easy hearing, which was exactly the number he had calculated. Miss Orvale, Lord Harlow said, with the expansive warmth of a man about to perform generosity that was not generous. How splendid to see Haversmere occupied again. I hear the improvements have been extensive. Thank you, she said. The mill required modernization. Modernization, he said, with the smile of a man who has found the word he wants and intends to use it. Yes, one does hear about the modernization. The new machinery, the new contracts, the new arrangements with the surrounding estates. He looked at the people within hearing, of whom there were 6, which was exactly the number he had calculated. Quite the enterprise for a young woman on her own. One wonders whether the county has been fully considered in all this enterprise. The word enterprise did the work it was designed to do. In another mouth, it was neutral. In his mouth, with his pause and his smile and his audience, it meant, you are trade, and you have inserted yourself into a place where trade does not belong. And everyone in this room understands the distinction even if they are too polite to say so. The county has been considered very carefully, she said, with the composure of a woman who had faced this variety of condescension in her father's boardrooms and London offices and had developed a thorough response to it. Of course, Harlow said. I merely observe that Dorset has a certain character, an established rhythm. One hopes that newcomers appreciate the rhythm before introducing too much. Novelty. Novelty. The second word that was not the word. The word underneath it was outsider, and the word underneath that was beneath us. And Sonara was formulating her response, the precise, measured, devastating response she had been constructing since she saw him begin his approach, when she heard the Duke's voice. The modernization at Haversmere Mill, the Duke said from her right, in a voice she had not heard before. Not the study voice, not the boundary stone voice, not the dinner voice, the one underneath all of them, the one that had 200 years of Dorset in it and knew exactly what it weighed. Includes a channel redesign that has resolved an irrigation failure affecting the Windmere South Meadows for 3 consecutive seasons. The new water contract Miss Orvale has established is the first formal, equitable agreement between the 2 properties in 50 years. He looked at Harlow with the complete, assessing attention that had once been directed at Sonara in his study and was now aimed at someone else entirely. The enterprise, as you describe it, has improved the output of every estate drawing from the wine, as anyone familiar with the river system would know. Lord Harlow's smile underwent a rapid and visible adjustment. Of course, I merely— The county, the Duke said, with the economy of a man who did not need volume because he had something better, which was authority. Benefits from landowners who invest in their properties rather than inheriting them and assuming the inheritance is sufficient. I believe that is a principle we can all agree on. He looked at Harlow for one moment longer than was necessary. In ducal terms, it was the equivalent of raising his voice, which he did not need to do and never would. Lord Harlow found someone else to talk to with the efficiency of a man who had been corrected publicly and needed distance to recover his composure. Sonara stood beside the Duke in the silence that followed. The room continued around them. 6 people had witnessed the exchange and would tell 6 more before the evening was over. And by morning, the county would have a new piece of information to incorporate into the story it had been following since October. She did not look at him. He did not look at her. He returned to the conversation with Sir Arden, and the man she now knew was a magistrate from the next county, and he talked about the road improvement as though nothing had happened, and nothing about his manner suggested that he had just done something that would be discussed at every dinner table in Dorset for the next month. She thought, he knows what he did. She thought, he's waiting to see what I do with it. She crossed the room to Lady Pentery, who looked at her expression, and then at the Duke across the room, and then back with the reading speed of a woman who had been decoding rooms for 4 decades. He intervened, Sonara said. He did not have to, Lady Pentery said, accepting a glass of wine from a passing footman. And Harlow will be cautious for the remainder of the season. He made it about the river, Sonara said, about the water contract and the irrigation. So that Harlow had no graceful way to continue, so that the room understood his position without requiring a declaration, and so that you were defended without being diminished. She paused. That is a very specific kind of intelligence, and it is not the kind he was using in October. Sonara held her glass and thought about 5 months of water contracts and boundary stones, and a book with an inscription from a dead father, and a man who had told her he expected obedience and had just stood beside her in a room full of people, and said, anyone familiar with the river system would know, which was not obedience, and was not deference, and was not any of the things he had said he wanted, and was instead the thing she had not known she needed, which was someone who understood that standing beside a person was not the same as standing in front of them. She looked across the room. He looked back, not the assessing attention. The other one, the one she had stopped pretending was not there. She held his gaze for 2 beats longer than the room required, and then she turned back to Lady Pentery and said something about the road improvement, and the assembly continued around them, and neither of them said anything further that evening. And the not saying was louder than anything either of them had said all winter. He came to Haversmere 3 days after the assembly, on a Tuesday morning, which was fast enough to mean the decision had been made before the assembly was over, and the 3 days had been the time it took to determine what to say. Sonara was not in the house. She was at the mill, on the platform above the water wheel with the foreman, reviewing spring flow readings. She was wearing a work dress with her sleeves turned back, and her hair pinned simply, which was the arrangement the Duke encountered when he arrived at the base of the mill in a coat that was practical rather than fashionable, a detail she had catalogued in December and was cataloguing again now. She came down from the platform. She did not hurry. She crossed the mill yard toward him with the steady pace of a woman on her own ground who was not going to rearrange herself for a visitor, even this visitor, especially this visitor. Your Grace, she said. Miss Orvale. He looked at the mill, at the water wheel, at the work dress and the ink on her right hand, with the attention of a man reading a situation and finding it was revising something he had believed about the world. I have come to say something, he said, and I would prefer to say it here rather than in a drawing room, because drawing rooms are for performances, and what I need to say is not a performance. She waited. In October, he said, in my study, what I said to you, the way I said it. He paused. He was looking at the water wheel rather than at her, and the not looking was the only indication that this was costing him something he wasn't accustomed to paying. I came to that meeting with a position that was finished before you sat down, a position that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with Marguerite. He said the name with the particular care of a man handling something that still had edges. She used the word independence the way some people use a weapon. She was independent of the vows, independent of the promises, independent of any obligation to the name she had taken. And I survived it by deciding that independence itself was the problem, rather than what she had done with it. He looked at her then. The architecture was gone. What was behind it wasn't weakness. It was the face of a man who had been carrying something heavy and had decided to set it down in front of the one person he trusted to see it clearly. I looked at you across that desk, and I saw a woman of independence, and I applied Marguerite's definition, and I was wrong. I was wrong about the definition, and I was wrong about you, and I have known it since December, and I should have said it before now. Senara looked at him. She looked at the mill behind her, and the river beside them, and the man who had come to her ground, and said what he had said, without deflection, without qualification, without asking her to forgive him before he had finished being honest. I am not a correction for Marguerite, she said. I am not a safer version of Marguerite. I am not the opposite of Marguerite, arranged in the shape of a wife to prove that you can survive a second time. I know, he said. Do you? I know it because you are nothing like her. She performed independence as a license. You practice it as a discipline. I could not see the difference in October because I was not looking at you. I was looking at a history. She was quiet for a moment. The water wheel turned beside them. The river ran past with the steady patience it had been running with since before either of them was born. I did not leave because you insulted me, she said. Though you did. I left because I understood that you were not seeing me, and that staying would have meant arguing with a man who was defending a wound, and arguing with a wound is a battle no one wins. You were right. I was right about leaving, she said. I was not entirely right about what I did next. He looked at her. I bought this mill because of you, she said. The property is sound. The water rights are valuable. All of that is true, and none of it is the reason I signed the contract 17 days after walking out of your study. She looked at the river. I was angry. I wanted you to see me, not the fortune and not the function. I wanted to stand on the other side of your river and be so competent and so impossible to dismiss that you would have to revise every conclusion you had reached about me. She looked at him. That was not a mature strategy. It was a devastating one, he said. It worked. It resulted in a water rights negotiation and 5 months of property discussions. It resulted in you being here, he said, in this mill yard, having this conversation. I consider the investment sound. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked at her. The distance between them was 3 feet of mill yard, and it was also 5 months of letters and boundary stones, and a book with an inscription and an assembly where he had stood beside her and said anyone familiar with the river system, and the 3 feet was the last of it. Aldrich, she said. He went still. She had not used his name before. She had used his title and his honorific and the careful space where a name would go, and now the name was in the mill yard between them, spoken beside the river that ran between their 2 estates, and it changed something that could not be unchanged. Senara, he said, and her name in his voice had the quality of a man saying a word he had been holding in reserve and finding that the sound of it was better than the holding. She stepped toward him. He met her in the middle of the mill yard, between the water wheel and the river, and they were very close, and the March morning was cold and clear around them, and what she saw in his expression was not damage. It was a man who had revised every assumption he had started with, and was standing in front of her with the full result visible in his face. He kissed her. It had the directness of a man who had arrived at a conclusion through evidence, and was prepared to act on it. And she kissed him back with the same precision she brought to contracts and water rights and every true decision she had ever made. And the mill wheel turned beside them, and the river ran past, and none of it required further negotiation. When they separated, she kept her hand on his arm and looked at him with the expression she wore when she was not managing anything at all. "The water contract is settled," she said. "The irrigation schedule is working. The South Meadows are dry for the first time in 3 years." He looked at her. "Are you conducting an estate review?" "I'm establishing that the practical matters are resolved before addressing the impractical ones." "And are they resolved?" She looked at the mill. She looked at the river. She looked at the man who had come to her ground and taken down his walls and said her name as though it were the answer to a question he had been carrying for 5 months. "Yes," she said. "They are entirely resolved." He took her hand, the one that had been on his arm. He held it with the grip she recognized from the boundary stone, brief and firm and meaning what it meant, except that this time he did not let go. "Sonara," he said. "Yes. I'm going to ask you something here, at your mill, on your ground, because I have learned that you do not make decisions on anyone's ground, but your own. And I am going to ask it without the word obedience, because the woman I want to marry is not a woman who obeys. She is a woman who decides, and I would rather have her decisions than anyone else's obedience." She held his gaze. She thought about October and the study and the word obedience falling between them like a door closing, and she thought about this moment in the mill yard with the word lifted and set aside and replaced with something that fit. "Then ask," she said. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "on the condition that you never again mistake my independence for a threat. It is the thing that brought me to your river. It is the thing that will keep me there." "Agreed," he said, unconditionally. She looked at their joined hands. She looked at him. She thought about the woman who had walked out of his study 5 months ago with a decision already forming, and the woman standing in a mill yard in March with the same decision arrived at by an entirely different road. And she found that both women were her, and neither of them was finished. And that was the part she liked best. And then it was June, and they were standing at the altar of St. Marin's Church, and he said the words that 47 people would remember for the rest of their lives, and she said the 2 words back, and neither of them meant what anyone in the church believed they meant. But before the altar, there was April, and in April, there was her father. He came to Haversmere on a Thursday, arriving from Cumbria, with the unhurried pace of a man who had received the letter 3 days ago and had spent the travel time deciding what he thought, which was his method, with all significant information. He sat in the mill house library with a cup of tea and the view of the river through the window, and he looked at his daughter with the attention that had never once missed anything important. "The Duke of Windermere," he said. "The man who told you he expected obedience. He has revised that position considerably." "Has he?" "He came to this mill yard and apologized without qualification and asked me to marry him without the word obedience in the sentence, and he meant both of those things in the way that I have learned to recognize when he means something, which is quietly and completely and without performance." Her father looked at the river through the window. "Is he good enough for you?" She thought about the question with the honesty it deserved. "He is trying to be," she said. "That is the best version of the answer." "It is," her father agreed. "It is the best version, because it means he knows the distance and is walking it, rather than believing he has already arrived." He set down his tea. "I will write to him." The letter Hewlin Orvale sent to the Duke of Windermere was 3 paragraphs long. It contained the precise dimensions of the Orvale fortune that would accompany the match, stated without apology or embellishment, in the manner of a man who had built everything he owned from a single mill and felt no need to decorate the accomplishment. The Duke's reply came the following morning. It was addressed to Senara, not to her father, which told her something. It said, "Your father's letter was generous and entirely beside the point. I am not marrying a fortune. I am marrying the woman who fixed my irrigation and argued my water rights, and was right about both." She read this twice. She put it in the desk drawer where she kept his letters. There were 14, going back to the first note about the boundary stone. She returned to the mill accounts with the focused attention of a woman who was deeply pleased and wasn't going to be impractical about it. Lady Pentery called on Friday with the contained energy of a woman who had been exercising restraint for 6 days, which was the maximum available to her on this subject. "The mill yard," Lady Pentery said before she had fully sat down. He proposed in the mill yard, not the drawing room, not the library, not Windmere Hall. "It is my ground," Senara said. He understood that. Lady Pentery accepted her tea. "He has been happy this week. I have not seen him happy in 3 years. He shows it very quietly and without announcement. But it is there." She looked at Senara. "You are good for him." "He is good for me," Senara said, "which is the part I did not expect. I expected to prove a point. I expected to be right." She paused. "I did not expect to discover that he was also right about certain things, and that the things he was right about were the things that made him worth the argument." Lady Pentery smiled, not the social smile, the real one. "He is going to discover," she said, "that he has acquired a wife who runs his neighbor's mill better than he runs his estate. He has already discovered it. He mentioned it twice during the proposal." Lady Pentery stood with the efficiency of a woman who had received everything she came for. At the door, she paused. "Harlow will be at the wedding, because it is better to have him inside the church behaving than outside it, talking. And because the sight of Lord Harlow watching you marry the Duke of Windmere will be among the most satisfying things I have witnessed in a considerable career. I find I am not above enjoying that," Senara said. And then it was June, and the church of St. Marin was full, and Senara was walking down the aisle on her father's arm, and the Duke of Windmere was standing at the altar with an expression that had nothing of October in it, and everything of every month since. She reached him. Her father placed her hand in his and sat down. The ceremony began, and when they reached the vows, the Duke looked at the woman beside him, and he said, in the voice that carried to every pew, "I expect obedience." And Senara turned to face him and said, clearly, without hesitation, "I do not." And the church held its breath. And the Duke of Windmere, standing at the altar of a church that had been there since the 13th century, looked at the woman who had just refused the word he had once believed was the foundation of a marriage, and he smiled. It wasn't the managed expression, was not the careful control. It was the smile she had seen for the first time in the mill yard in March, the one that belonged to the man behind the walls, and he looked at the Reverend Mr. Bassett, who was holding his prayer book with the practiced composure of a man who had been told in advance that this moment was coming and had agreed to allow it. And the Duke said in the same clear voice, "No, she does not." He turned back to Senara. "She does not obey," he said. "She decides, she considers, she investigates and negotiates and argues and arrives at conclusions that are almost always correct and occasionally infuriating. And she does all of this on her own ground, in her own time, by her own authority." He held her gaze. The church was absolutely silent. "I do not want obedience," he said. "I wanted it once. I was wrong. I want a partner who will tell me when I am wrong and show me what right looks like and stand on the other side of a river and make me come to her." He looked at her with the full, unguarded expression that she had watched build since December, the one that had nothing managed in it, and nothing of October, and everything of the man he had become in the months between. "I want you," he said, "exactly as you are. That is my vow." Senara looked at him. She looked at the 47 faces, at her father in the front pew with his eyes bright, at Lady Pentery 3 rows back, whose composure was intact and whose eyes were not, at Lord Harlow 8 rows back, whose expression was the particular blank of a man witnessing something he had no framework for. She looked at the Duke. "Then I have a vow as well," she said. The church waited. "I will not obey you," she said. "I will challenge you and disagree with you and reorganize your library without asking permission and redirect your irrigation channels and argue your water rights and be right about most of it and wrong about some of it and honest about all of it." She held his gaze. "And I will choose you," she said, "every morning, of my own free will, on my own ground, by my own authority. Not because I was told to, because I decided to. That is my vow, and it is the only one worth making." He took her hand. Not the handshake, not the brief, firm, contractual grip of the boundary stone. He took her hand and held it and did not let go. And the Reverend Mr. Bassett, who had been holding his prayer book with considerable patience, completed the ceremony with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the real vows had already been spoken, and the formal ones were a courtesy to tradition. They were married. The church exhaled. Hewlin Orvale stood and looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who had been watching her make decisions for 23 years and had just watched her make the best one. The wedding breakfast was at Windermere Hall because it was the larger house and because the county expected it. Senara had already identified 4 things she intended to change about the dining room arrangement and had told Aldrich about 3 of them, saving the 4th for after the wedding, because strategy was a habit she was not going to abandon simply because she was now a duchess. She moved through the breakfast with the ease of a woman on ground that was becoming her own. She talked with Sir Arden, with Lady Pentery, and eventually with her father, who found her at the edge of the room in the late afternoon. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. He smiled at the altar. He did. When you said you would not obey him, he smiled. He did. Her father looked at the room. He looked at the Duke across it, managing the reception with the quiet precision of a man who had been doing this for 20 years, and was doing it today with a quality he had not shown at any previous occasion, a lightness that was small and real and visible to anyone who knew where to look. "You are going to be a magnificent duchess," her father said. "I know," she said. "I intend to be." He laughed. The full, genuine laugh of a man who had spent 23 years being proud of this person and had decided that today was the correct day to let it show completely. Aldrich found her in the evening. The June light was long and golden across the Dorset hills, and she was standing at the edge of the Windermere grounds, where the land sloped down toward the river, toward Haversmere, toward the mill and the water wheel and the boundary stone where they had shaken hands in December and begun whatever this was. "The river," he said, coming to stand beside her. "The river," she confirmed. He looked at the water in the distance, the late light on its surface, the ash trees along the bank where he had ridden to meet her in November, on a black horse he had chosen deliberately. "All of it," he said. "The river and the mill and the water rights and this house and everything in it. All of it is yours, in every way that matters." She looked at him. "That is a considerable statement from a man who once told me he expected obedience." "That man was an idiot," he said. "I have it on good authority. Yours. You have been proving it since October, with a thoroughness I can only describe as comprehensive. She looked at the river. She looked at the Haversmere chimneys visible beyond the ash trees, the mill that she had bought because she was angry and strategic and unwilling to be dismissed. And that had become something she had not planned for, which was the ground on which she had been seen clearly for the first time by a man who had needed 5 months and a water rights negotiation to learn how to look. "Aldrich," she said. "Yes. I am going to reorganize the Windmere Library. The system has no logical basis. I expected nothing less. And the tenant contracts need revising. Several are outdated. I assumed." He looked at her with the expression she now knew was his version of complete happiness, which was quiet and unhurried and entirely present. "Senara," he said. "Yes. Is there anything about this estate you do not intend to change?" She looked at him. She thought about October and the study and the word obedience and the woman who had stood and left without argument. And she thought about June and the altar and the word decide and the woman who had stood and stayed. Both women were the same woman, and the through line between them was the decision to be seen clearly and to see clearly in return. "You," she said, "I do not intend to change you. You have done that yourself, and the result is entirely acceptable." He took her hand. She let him take it. They stood at the edge of the Windmere grounds in the long June light, with the river in the distance, and the county going about its business around them, and the whole story behind them. From October to June, from obedience to choice, from a study where a man had asked for the wrong thing to a mill yard where a woman had given him the right one. Her father had always said that the soundest decisions were the ones that made more sense with every passing month than they had on the day you signed. This one was already making sense she had not anticipated, and June was only the beginning.